Hey there, fellow classic comic collectors. As always, I'm Scott Harris King. Today I'm bringing you the strange story of Mighty Man, a comic about a black superhero in the 1970s that I've never heard of before. And then once I started looking into it, the story behind it is just mind-boggling. So I had to do a video to talk about it. It's a whole new thing to me. I hope you're going to find this interesting. Before I jump into that, just real quick, just a reminder that my Kickstarter for my comic, The Crimebusters #4, is currently live. I have the link down below. You can go and check it out if you're interested. It's a real labor of love for me. It's taken me over a year to draw this issue. And if you missed the previous issues or the other comics that I've made, you can get them all as add-ons or in package deals. So if you're interested, you can check that out. But today, we're not focusing on my comics. We're focusing on this comic called Mighty Man. So I'm going to put the cover up here on the screen of issue 1. I think one of the issues anyway. Mighty Man. I saw this come across my feed a little while ago in a Facebook group I was on, and I was just really puzzled because, I feel like I know a lot about comics, a lot about Bronze Age comics, and a particular interest to me is the representation of minority characters, but specifically female lead and black characters. Not entirely, I can't really explain why, but I find it just really interesting, I guess, as sort of a cultural artifact to just see how those characters were treated and developed, and how black creators were doing work in the industry. I think comics as a medium is sort of always been a medium created by the underdogs, by people that didn't have a voice. If you look at the original comic creators. And so anyway, I just find it all really interesting. So I make a point to track down when I can comics with black characters. I have a Lobo #1 from 1965, and first appearance of Falcon, and Luke Cage, and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm very interested in this, particularly the Silver and the Bronze Age, when we start to see these characters. And I thought I knew all of the characters, but here we have Mighty Man, comic I've never heard of before, and it's clearly a Bronze Age book. Even if you couldn't tell from the price, it just looks like a Bronze Age book. It feels like a Bronze Age book. It looks really professionally done. Why have I never heard of this before? Well, there's a couple reasons. So I started looking into it, and on the surface, it's a fascinating thing. The first thing and key thing is that it's not from the United States. So it's not an American comic. It's not a British comic either. It's actually from South Africa. And here's where the story starts to get really interesting. So obviously this was during apartheid. And so having a comic like Mighty Man with a black lead superhero character seems really unusual and progressive for apartheid South Africa, right? And so the character is a guy who's kind of like a Superman, but he has an origin story that seems to be, as far as I could tell, kind of rooted in the cultural traditions of the indigenous peoples of the South African, that part of the continent, right? So basically, he's a guy who's a cop, and there's some shenanigans going on, and he ends up, I forget exactly, but I've read the first issue, he gets shot or something and dumped in like a lake. But it turns out that in the lake, there's this race of water people who live at the bottom of this lake, and they bring him down there and they heal him. And when they do that, it imbues him with incredible powers. And so he goes back to the surface and he solves this crime he's working on. He's got this very Superman sort of secret identity where he is kind of pretends to be bumbling, and then there's a woman who's sort of his version of Lois Lane, who is into Mighty Man, and it's very, you can see the connection to Superman, but again, published black lead character in South Africa during apartheid, really interesting, right? And then if you look at the first page, I'm going to try and put it up here, there of the first issue, there's this introduction from the publisher who's saying, they want to have this positive role model for black readers and all this stuff, and it seems like really interesting, right? really great. The thing is, though, none of it's true, right? None of it's true. So yes, it was published in South Africa, but the publisher here, not the publisher at all. Totally bogus. Because in fact, this was secretly published by the apartheid government in South Africa as sort of subtle pro-apartheid propaganda. So my understanding is the idea here was they have the main character, again, is a police officer, and he's very sort of law and order. A lot of the bad guys that we see in here, a lot of them are black people from the wrong side of the tracks who are, uh, you know, criminals and drug runners and stuff. And so I guess the idea was to sort of indoctrinate the reader subtly in the ideas of law and order, following the government rules, following, listening to the police and doing what you're told, and at the same time stigmatizing the members of the black community who were sort of fighting against that sort of thing, and rebelling against the system, right? So it was a very subtle messaging, but the story's really too complicated to get into. But basically, there was this guy in the government who was doing these sort of secret propaganda schemes. This was one of them, and he was misappropriating, it turns out, money from the defense of the country's like defense funds. And so eventually it was found out, and everything was shut down, and he was like brought up on charges, and so this was sort of like a secret clandestine sort of underground, again, government program, but it was not known at most levels of government. It was just sort of like this their version of like a CIA thing going on, right? So crazy, right? But I haven't even gotten to the craziest part yet. The reason that the book looks so professional and so 70s, like has that classic Bronze Age feel, is because it was actually done by people from DC Comics, right? So it wasn't done by DC. What happened was they basically set up they went to the United States, and they hired a public relations firm to set everything in motion with the comic book. That firm, I don't know whether they hired the people directly or there was another go-between, but what they ended up doing was that they hired, according to the sources that I've read, 14 freelance comic book creators who worked at DC Comics. Now, I don't know whether any of them also worked at Marvel or Atlas or any of the other 70s. I don't know, because I don't know who they all were. So the sources mentioned that there were 14 of these people, but they only had the names of 2 of them that I've been able to find. Those 2 were John Albano, who is probably best known as a co-creator of Jonah Hex. But the big one who was involved with doing Mighty Man was Joe Orlando. So the people on Facebook that were talking about this, that brought this comic to my attention, said that Joe Orlando apparently was quite conservative in his politics. I don't know whether that's true, and I don't know how much personal feelings sort of went into the decision to work for this company. I don't know how much the freelancers doing the comic knew about everything that was going on, but they definitely knew some, because according to the researchers, all the comics are currently at an archive at a university, right? And I'll put the link down below if you want to read these, because they have digitized them so you can read them. And according to them, basically the people, at DC, the DC people who were doing Mighty Man, when they were drawing the comics and stuff and writing the comics, because they were also writing these, they were making the characters too American, right? So they were drawing them and writing them as though they were Black Americans in the 70s. And so they would basically had like specialists come over and explain to them how to write and draw them so they seemed more like Black South Africans. So they knew what they were doing. It's just unclear if they knew that the comic was actually being done by the government as like pro apartheid propaganda, or if they thought that this fake publisher that we saw earlier was actually publishing and they didn't understand the underlying messaging. So one thing that's interesting is the guy who set this all up, I forget his name, I should have researched it before I did the video, but it's too much work. You can check it out in the links below. His wife apparently is like a cultural anthropologist or something, and so she actually did a lot of the writing and messaging and working into the stories a lot of the specific sort of cultural referencing and stuff, like the undersea, the mythological aspects. There was a second title, actually. I think it was called Tiger Man, that was also coming out at the same time. So there were these two titles, and they ran for a while. I think Mighty Man ran for something like 17 issues or more, and Tiger Man ran for about the same. Now, these comics are incredibly rare now. I did a quick look on eBay a little while ago. There was one copy of one issue, and the guy wanted $2,500. And of course, that's crazy, but they're extremely rare. Obviously, those small print runs to begin with because it's a pretty small country. They were specifically aimed at the Black community. And, it's a community that doesn't necessarily have a tradition of comic book collecting, in the 1970s. So my understanding is they're extremely rare. And again, most of the known copies are at this university where they've nicely digitized them. But it's just absolutely boggling to me that Joe Orlando was heading up a secret pro-apartheid propaganda comic aimed at the Black South African community, and was doing this while he was like one of the big figures. So this is like 1976, right? 77, that era. One of the big top people at DC at the time. It's crazy to me. I wish I knew who the other 12 people were, and I'd love to hear something from the people that worked on this explaining like their view of things and their side of things, because I was just absolutely flummoxed when I heard this. So anyway, that's Mighty Man. I'll have the links down below so you can check all this stuff out, and let me know what you think in the comments below. If you know anything else about this comic, tell me, because I'm fascinated by it. But anyway, there it is, the totally bizarre story of Mighty Man. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.